Okay. Well, I wasn't necessarily planning on giving a whole history. But I will, because there are a number of people who've never heard of him, never heard his name. But there is, the article, we've written on him in the past, and the article that's on the front cover of this week's paper goes into some of his political history, and articles going back to last summer when he actually won the mayoral race, and Jackson sort of talk about the build-up for that, as well as the campaign and the program. But I'll talk about the Jackson Push program, but I'll give a sort of talk about him as well. Chokwe died on February 25th. I was actually in an airport getting ready to go to Denver to help build a campaign to free up a prisoner who's been in prison for 27 years by the name of Clarence Moses L. And to meet with activists and start planning, protests and other actions to win his freedom because he was wrongfully accused and wrongfully imprisoned. And got a text from a comrade that he had passed away. Most of us here did not necessarily, some of us here have known him through the years, through interactions in the political movement. We've been in meetings with him. If those of us who are in the Black Left Unity have been in, the conferences with him and have had conversations with him, but I don't know if anyone here knew him deeply in a personal way. And so I definitely can't claim to know him deeply in a personal way. But it's not, the personal, even though he was actually a very likable person and easy to talk to and very approachable and, was very gentle. He was tall, a very gentle, nice person. But it's not necessarily, the personal attributes as to why there are personal attributes led to him becoming who he was, but that's not what we're here to necessarily talk about. It was a great personal tragedy for his family, for his siblings. He was the oldest or second oldest of 8. For his children, he had 3 children. One, the oldest is Cam, from a previous relationship, and he has 2 children from his wife, Nubia, who passed away a number of years ago. And for nieces and nephews and friends and the people of Jackson, where he had lived for 30 years, it's a great personal tragedy to have lost. And it's also a great tragedy for the political movement. But going back to his passing, it was a shock for a lot of people. As far as most people knew, he was healthy, and I'm not going to necessarily go into his health, except to say that he had had some challenges and some troubles, that he had been receiving treatment and been responding positively to that treatment. And so those who knew him personally were very shocked. His son took him to the hospital that day. He'd been having conversations with people on the telephone, and in a few hours he passed away. And for those who've been around in the political movement, this smells of many other instances where a person had been leading a struggle and died suddenly. A lot of people liken it to what happened with Harold Washington in Chicago,
right,
who had been given a clean bill of health and supposedly died of a heart attack in office. It seems very similar to that, but we don't know. There wasn't an autopsy performed. The movement was raising money, and Minister Farrakhan of the Nation of Islam said, "You don't have to raise money. I will pay for the autopsy." And so the autopsy actually was performed, and they are awaiting the results of that autopsy. And it takes like weeks. I had to know because we had to have an autopsy for my mother. It takes weeks to get the information back, especially when you're doing the chemical analysis of bodily fluids and things of that nature. It takes a long time for that to come back. But the struggle continues. But, just to give you a sense of him and his politics, on February 14th, which was 11 days before he passed away, as the right wing and ultra right wing in Venezuela was creating unrest, and it looked like there was a possibility of another coup happening, similar to what happened in 2002 in Venezuela, and that there was the threat that the U.S. was gearing up to condemn the leadership of the Bolivarian Republic. Mayor Chokwe Lumumba released a statement, and his statement partially says, "My administration is deeply concerned with the political unrest and violence occurring in Venezuela. We strongly condemn the killings that occurred and call on the United States and all of the governments to respect the outcome of the national elections of December 2013. We firmly call on all foreign governments to respect the sovereignty and self-determination of the Bolivarian government of Venezuela and not interfere in its internal affairs." I don't think you'll find any other politician in the U.S. who releases statements like that.
Right.
And if anybody knows of anyone, tell me. That gives you an indication of his spirit of internationalism and his understanding of the support that is needed for these struggles around the world. And so with that position, and you know, Jackson, compared to New York, is a small city. But Jackson is the largest city in Mississippi. Jackson and the surrounding area, the city has about 170,000 some people, but the surrounding areas of the city, the entire metropolitan area, has about 500,000 people within it. And you're talking about a state that is the poorest in the country, has the largest number of people on Medicaid, and it has one of the worst educational systems in the country. It has crumbling infrastructure, and it was one of the most brutal and continues to be one of the most brutal areas for oppressed people, for black people in particular in the country. So it was no small thing that he won the mayoral race in the city of Jackson, which is the seat of the state government, when the governor at that time was Haley Barbour. And it wasn't just because he was a nice person while he ran. I mean, technically, you can have an imperialist scumbag who might be nice. They might shake your hand and smile at you. They might give you even a hug. Maybe George Bush was nice. You remember when he ran the first time, they said he seemed like somebody you can drink a beer with and talk with. And they didn't tell you till after he was elected that he actually did not drink anymore. But they allowed that to be sort of the narrative, that he seemed like a nice, like a regular, everyday, every person, right? But he might technically be nice. Bill Clinton might have been nice. He played saxophone on Arsenio Hall. Anybody see that? He went up to Harlem. They opened an office in Harlem. They went to Sylvia's. He may technically have been a very nice person. But the reason why Chokwe Lumumba won the mayoral race in Jackson, Mississippi, is partly because of the 30 years of struggle going back to the Republic of New Africa that he won. But it was also because of the Jackson Kush plan. It was because he ran on a platform of struggle. A platform that people can relate to because they have seen their infrastructure crumbling. You can go and drive through Jackson. You know, I used to spend my summers in Mississippi when I was a kid because that's where my family is from. And so I've seen a lot of the state. And you can go through Jackson and you can take pictures of Jackson and set them side by side with pictures of parts of Detroit and parts of Baltimore. And you might be confused as to which is which. Because it looks like that, where the streets are torn up. You have whole areas in downtown, it's a ghost town. You know, except for the new convention center, that's all bright and shiny, but a lot of it is sort of crumbling. And there's actually, in the sewage system, for instance, in the streets, you know, there's a consent decree put on by the federal government because of the leaking of sewage, because of how outdated the sewage system is. And so you would ask, how did that happen? And it happened because it's a city just like Detroit, that is a majority black city. Jackson is a city of 80% black people. And so if you look at any inner city area that is predominantly black or predominantly oppressed people, you will see that there's been years and years of divestment from those areas, where everything has been allowed to crumble and fall down. And now we see a reversal of developers coming in and taking over areas that are populated by predominantly people of color and pushing them out. But before they get there, the police come there and they create these quality of life ordinances that make it unbearable for us to just breathe and be black and walk around and have dignity. And then you have the developers come behind that. I used to always say, as a joke, don't take offense to it, that if you see a white person walking their dog in a black community, well, there goes the neighborhood. Because, and they would do some they'll do some funky shit in Denver, northeast Denver. They had children's parks that they would turn to dog walks, to dog runs. They would take away the children's park and turn it into a dog run. And, you would see these people driving up in their SUVs and whatnot and getting out with their nice big dogs and walking around a dog run, and the kids ain't got no place to play. So this is Jackson. And because of that whole history, because of what was happening, because all the bourgeois politicians would make promises and then not be able to do anything because they didn't run on a platform that was designed to actually fight for the needs and wants of people in the city, nothing really happened with it. And the local bourgeois folks there who represent the banks and big business there, they didn't so much care about the people of Jackson. As a matter of fact, while Chokwe was running, a lot of these businesses, which are predominantly white, had threatened that if he had won the mayoral race, they would leave. If the people had made their decision, made their choice of who they wanted to represent them, then they would pick up and leave. But we live in a democracy, don't we? We're supposed to respect people's choices, right? Isn't that what we're told? You get a right to decide who represents you. But if they don't like that, then what do? They try to do their best to undermine it. So when he came into the mayoral race with this program, and just to give you some of the highlights, out of the movement after Hurricane Katrina, the People's Human Rights Fund, and other organizations, I can't remember Monica, you remember the name of the organization in Jackson, Mississippi, that out of this organization came the Jackson People's Assembly. The name sort of skips my mind. And the Jackson People's Assembly was designed to actually give a voice and empower people in the oppressed community, specifically the black masses in the city of Jackson. And so it's sort of like what we are trying to do to build the assembly movement. And it's, to build it to a point of, long-term prospects is dual power. And what dual power really is when you rival the bourgeois state, where you have your own police, you have your own courts, and you rival them, and it just becomes a struggle for power. That's a long-term prospect. But what the Jackson People's Assembly is, it represented real participatory. What they want is, in the short run, is to be real participatory democracy, where people make decisions about what happens in their community, and they struggle around those things. And so Chokwe was picked as a candidate for the city council through the Jackson People's Assembly, and he won. And he was an uncompromising city council person, like Charles Barron, and now Sister Inez Barron. You got a lot of people that don't have deep politics, they're not revolutionary, and they're technically nice people, and they say good things, but then they get in city council, and they're just so happy to be there. And, they make, before you know it, they're making they start with just a small compromise, and before you know it, they done gave everything away. But he wasn't that kind of person. And it was the Jackson People's Assembly and the energy that they built up and the work that he did as city council that led to him being successful in winning the mayoral race. And not only did he win, he had to force a runoff, but in the runoff he won 87% of the electorate. That's no small victory. When the business people were saying, if he wins, we'll leave. We'll pack everything up and we're just going to go. We're not going to stay under administration of Chokwe Lumumba. The governor, William Winter, former governor, who actually spoke at the funeral, and to his credit, he said, I was wrong. I was very, very wrong. He even said himself, he wasn't governor anymore, but if Chokwe moves, if he wins, he's going to divide people. And they thought that he would divide people because of his history and the fact that he dared fight for self-determination for oppressed people. And what does that mean, self-determination for oppressed people? See, when I first came into the party, I read documents like Blast Furnace Brothers. I read Busing and Self-Determination. I read Letter to White Workers in Louisiana, written by Sam Marcy. And I understood that one of the foundation and pillars of this party is the support and the understanding of the national question and the support of self-determination of all oppressed people. And I would not have chosen an organization that does not understand that. And does not understand that the oppression that this country was built off of extreme wealth, the foundation of capital, was the enslavement and genocide and colonization of these lands, and the enslavement of African people, and the colonization and genocide committed against indigenous people, and then the stealing of over half of Mexico, the taking of Puerto Rico, that the wealth of this country was, and of all of Europe, was built off of that. And it is created, in particular to the black nation, out of many nations, one nation through a shared historical experience of slavery, and then de facto slavery, the peonage laws and all of that, and sharecropping, and then good old-fashioned American apartheid. And so because his history of struggle and fighting for self-determination for the oppressed black nation, and the fact that he still, before he died, he actually, one of his quotes, he said, "I told you I was running on a platform of compassion and human rights for all people. That's my story and I'm sticking to it. Free the land." This is after he won, because he dared continue to hold that up as a mantra, free the land. He would be divisive. Because you dared fight for the rights of oppressed people, that's divisive. It's not divisive to ignore the suffering of the masses of oppressed people. It's not divisive to ignore the police brutality to go into our communities, but if you dare to fight against that, that's divisive. How dare you? But because of that history, like I said, and because of the program of building people's assemblies, wanting to expand just beyond just having a Jackson People's Assembly, which met quarterly, to having neighborhood assemblies where they would address neighborhood problems, where people can go and talk about their problems and how to fix them, and that he wanted to govern through this burgeoning assembly movement and expand that out from Jackson and across Mississippi, because they wanted to create a solidarity economy where there is such a large percentage, especially of black youth in particular, who are unemployed, where he wanted to draw in not just black people, but also, immigrants, and he fought for immigrant rights and the rights of Latino people to not be profiled and pulled over. And he wanted to create this solidarity economy of worker-run cooperatives. That's what galvanized people to go to the polls and vote for him, because they didn't see any other alternative. They could have chose some of the other people, but they didn't have a program. They didn't have a platform that spoke to them, but Chokwe did, and that's why he ran the mayoral race. And it was, it's interesting because he was only in office for 8 months. And there were a lot of people, if you read some of the papers, who said he was the best mayor we ever had. In 8 months, he was the best mayor that we ever had. He barely got to implement any of his plans, but he was the best mayor that they ever had. You see, there was something that he had to do that was painful. Because in order to fix the infrastructure of Jackson, they would need $2 to $3 billion. And he came into this reality of having to fix this, and how do you do it? And they floated an increase in the sales tax, which is, increasing tax is a regressive thing. Sales tax in Mississippi was 6%, increased to 7%, and they increased the rates for water and sewage. But he actually put it to a referendum. He ran on this mantra of different ones, free the land, but also let the people decide. And so he put it to the people, and he explained it to them and said, this is a painful thing. We don't want to have to do this, but we're faced with this problem that has to be fixed. And maybe there were other ways. Maybe there weren't. I don't know. Can any of us claim to actually really know? But the people overwhelmingly chose by 90% because they trusted him and believed in the platform that he ran on. And they found him to be someone that you can go to, who listened to the people, who was out amongst the people and talked to the people and made decisions based off of what he heard from people. And so he was the best mayor that they ever had, who only served 8 months in office. You know, I went to the memorial. It was actually the same day that the IWD march was had. And, you know, as a party, we had, you know, to be honest, it caught us by surprise when he won the mayoral race. Because we're used to revolutionaries running, but not expecting to win. Often we run not really to get, you know, have a platform, but not really, you know, trying to win. It gives you a platform from which to speak. And your voice is and the voice in the platform and the program is amplified. But it caught us by surprise. But we caught up. We caught up quickly to the circumstances of Jackson because it was energizing. There was simply nothing like it. You know, we had the sister run in Seattle around supporting the increase of the minimum wage to $15 an hour, which was an important victory. And running as a socialist is an important victory. But this was something much more profound and much more different in Jackson because it was a struggle. It was a living and breathing struggle, and it was the national question and the fight and struggle for self-determination. That's what makes it different because everything that was on that program, in order to get it, it had to be fought for. Mississippi doesn't allow for cooperatives. They allow for farming cooperatives. That's it. So in order to get Mississippi to change, there's a right-wing administration in the state, there has to be a struggle. You know, it's very interesting looking at all of the people who were running and being in Jackson, because some of the people who were running were there at the funeral. They didn't speak, but they were making statements to the press afterwards, and every single one of them, they could have said, the ones who were deciding to run, they could have said, oh, well, we didn't like the way things were going, and our ideas are different. Our administration would be different, and this is what we're going to do. They could have went with him being divisive, and we wanted, but every single person that is running has to address the Jackson program. Every single person who was running had to talk about the success of Mayor Chokwe Lumumba. And so they all said, we want to continue the legacy of Chokwe Lumumba. Every single one. Now they're lying, but they can't win otherwise. That's the point. They know that the electorate has changed, and that in order for them to become mayor so they can undo everything that was done, is they have to speak to that program. But they're in the process of doing that, they're trying to sort of make him out to see, it happened very quickly. Usually it takes a while before somebody like Chokwe dies, before they try and, rehabilitate them in the public. And they become less militant. They haven't figured out a way to do it with Malcolm yet. But they did it with Martin. They've been trying to do it in a very light way with Chokwe. They've been trying to make it, this. But like if you read his statements that he was saying, he didn't stop being militant. He never apologized for what he stood for and fought for. Not once did he apologize. Not once did he say, that I was young and, young people, it was the 60s and 70s and, hey, look, I was 20 years old and a lot of things were going on. He never said that not once. He kept to, it's like he said, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. He did not betray the struggle. He did not betray his principles. He remained a revolutionary till he took his last breath. And he remained a person who wanted to fight and struggle, and understanding that ultimately what we need is socialism. And he remained a person who wanted to build and fight and struggle for and win self-determination for the black nation, especially in the Black Belt South. He didn't change. He saw it as a process. So when we were there, you know, at the funeral, first of all, it was huge. It was in the same. It wasn't the Jackson Convention Center, the same place where they had after the inauguration. Comrade Diane and Atlanta and I both went to the inauguration as well. They had this party. It was like the celebratory atmosphere, and it was like nothing like it. It was electric. There was like currents, and hair was standing on end. My dreadlocks were probably standing up. And, you know, everybody sort of felt it, even if you didn't live in Jackson, because, you know, a lot of people came from out of the state, from around the state, and came from out of the state. They wanted to be there because they understood what it meant. So the funeral was had in the same place. And the outpouring of people was so massive that they had to have them in an overflow area. You know, you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of people. And, you know, there were people from throughout his, you know, people from MXGM, Malcolm X Grassroots, from the African People's Organization, people who's go back 40 years with Chokwe, Mississippi Mass Choir sang, you know, Cassandra Wilson sang. You know, I wish I knew the brother's name, but he sang Chokwe's favorite song, and I was glad to hear that his favorite song was a Smokey Robinson song. Anybody know what it is? Temptation sang a lot of Smokey's. Smokey wrote a lot of songs for Temptations. My Girl, that was his favorite song. Oh my God. So they sang that song, and they sang, you know, there was this African traditions of, you know, sending someone off. It was a homegoing celebration. And, you know, people sort of recounted stories. As one of his brothers recounted a story and said, you know, I take responsibility, sort of paraphrasing, for his, you know, political involvement, because he said, when I was a kid, we had a tree house, and I wasn't supposed to be out past 9, and I had a candle, and, you know, and we were going outside, and I caught myself on fire, and my brother appeared behind me, he pushed me down and rolled me over and put out the fire. And he was like, and he was putting out fires for me, and that's why he became political. You know, there was people from the immigrant rights movement spoke. William Winter was the former governor, spoke, and he actually did say that he made a mistake, you know, for whatever that means. But, you know, I respect people who put him on the program. Obviously, he must have, after he realized that mistake, had been of some help. But the most moving part was the speeches given by his two youngest children. He and Nubia's two youngest children, Rakia and Chokwe Antar. And it's hard I tried to eulogize my mother, and I almost passed out. I couldn't even get the words out. It's like I just couldn't get them out. And I imagine it was not it, but they handled it very well, and it was very polished. And I remember his son, who's 30 and who's a lawyer, and he said that Chokwe Lumumba lives in the people's struggle, and he will never die. And he said, my father lives in me. And Diane and I turned to one another and said, he's going to be the next mayor of Jackson. And on Monday at 5:30, he announced that he's running for mayor of Jackson. You know, it must have felt like a lot of people when we heard that he died. It felt like that whole struggle died, because it hadn't got to the point where it was like a boulder rolling down the hill and it would take a mighty force to stop. It hadn't gotten there yet. He was very much integral. It's like if Hugo Chavez had died a year after taking office and had never gotten a chance to implement, you know, the process, the Bolivarian process in Venezuela. That's what it felt like. And I'm sure that a lot of people may have felt that way. You know, I'm sure that people who had been there all along and who would live in Jackson had felt that way. I'm sure some of the advisors had felt that way. But after the funeral, I'm not so much worried about it dying. His son is right, it lives. And I believe that it's going to continue, it's going to deepen, and what it needs is from the political movement, the entire political movement, not just the black nationalist, revolutionary black nationalist movement, but the revolutionary communist movement has to catch up to it. Because the attempts to derail it have already started. You know, they tried to put Jackson under emergency financial management. The bill luckily did not make it out of committee, but it will return. There's been surveillance on activists in Jackson, some of our comrades. And I think all of us here probably consider Chokwe Lumumba a comrade, don't we? Yeah. We lost a comrade, right? Some of his comrades have been surveilled. The bill for the cooperative law was never even sent to committee because some conversations that had taken place between leadership and the unions had been verbatim spit back as the rationale for not putting that bill through committee. And I'm sure there's about 100 other things that are happening that we will find out in the coming days. And that's why it's important for us to not just have this meeting, but to strategize and figure out a way that we can get people to Jackson, Mississippi. To figure out a way that we can get people there, if possible, to support and help before the mayoral race on April 8th, and to get people there afterwards to support the struggles that are going on there, so that people can learn, so they can hone their skills and see it for themselves and see a living struggle. Because this, if it continues, will not just be a beacon for the rest of the struggle. It might be a guide. It might be a rallying cry. It might be something that is a spark and turns into a prairie fire. It might be just what we need in the revolutionary struggle. And we have to put it in the context of the entire South. Everybody knows about Moral Mondays, right? They know that it's spreading to South Carolina, spreading to Georgia, it's spreading to Alabama, it's spreading to Tennessee. What's happening in Mississippi is in that context, except it's an advancement over that. And it just, people look to New York and they look to San Francisco, they look to Boston for leadership. But I gotta tell you, we ought to be looking to the South. Mm-hmm. So, thank you, comrades. Long live our comrade Chokwe Lumumba. Long live the struggle in Jackson, Mississippi, and the struggle for self-determination. And let's find out how we can get this brilliant living struggle the attention that it needs, because it bodes well for the future revolution to come. Thank you. The Jackson People's Assembly was, actually I didn't remember it, I looked it up. Was born out of this Jackson Human Rights Coalition. You know, I've been forgetting things, you know, and I think it's because we have a newborn at the house. I think the older she gets, the more I forget. Maybe there's a term for that. And, but that's, you know, where it came up. And I forgot, you know, some of the things, because I wanted to get a little bit of, you know, a history of Chokwe, and I didn't do that. He was, you know, he was a lawyer for a long time. After the PGRNA, the Provisional Government of Republic of New Africa, their office was attacked. You know, there was like a real intense, hot, you know, there's hot and there's cold. There was a hot war against liberation movements in the country. And, you know, it's hard to sort of, and especially, you know, they assassinated members of the Black Liberation Movement, and they attacked the FBI and the police department in Jackson, attacked the PGRNA's headquarters outside of Jackson, and people were arrested, and they actually were freed later on. But he had this rich history, and in recent history, it was through the work of the Jackson Human Rights Coalition and Chokwe Lumumba that led to the person who killed Medgar Evers, who was killed in Jackson, Mississippi, being retried. And Merle Evers Williams actually spoke to that specifically. He also worked on the case of Geronimo Jijaga, who passed away a few years ago in Tanzania. Most people who were hip to the Black Panthers in that period in history would know him as Geronimo Pratt. He was a former soldier. He was actually in the 82nd Airborne Division, and he actually trained the Black Panthers in Los Angeles. And it was through his training, his military training, that led to them fortifying their headquarters in Los Angeles. Otherwise, they would have been massacred by the Los Angeles Police Department when it attacked the Black Panthers office in Los Angeles. But through his training, they were able to survive that, and they held off the police for like 4 hours. But he had this rich and brilliant history, and I think that every revolutionary who has contributed to the struggle deserves to be memorialized, and that's why we're memorializing our comrade tomorrow. And for every revolutionary that is well known, there are thousands of others who die in different circumstances, who people may never hear from. But it is not an easy thing to choose this life. Most people in here could be doing something else and could be quite successful at it. But we have a drive, and that drive brings us to the movement, but it is our principles as revolutionary Marxists that keep us in the movement. And no matter how difficult things get, we remain in the movement because we believe and have optimism that we will win. We may not win in our lifetime, but it is the foundation, but we hope to win in our lifetime. And it is the struggle that, that the foundation that is built that will ultimately lead to a victory. Because if there's not revolution to overturn capitalism and imperialism in this country, and they're allowed to continue waging wars around the world to destroy the environment, then we don't have much of a future left. That's as simple as you can put it. Without revolution, humanity has not much of a future left. So that's why we struggle. And, also, one of the things that they're doing currently, and I'll end on this, is they're building the Jackson Rising Conference. The Jackson Rising Conference from May 2nd to the 4th is sort of, they've raised almost $12,000 for it so far, and it is actually to begin the important work of not only just building the cooperatives, and we have to understand cooperatives. There's cooperatives around the country, they have them around the world. They're not necessarily revolutionary themselves, but it's the struggle to build them, and it's the entire plan in total, and it's actually empowering the workers and unemployed, especially the black masses in Jackson, which is the point. It's not the mayoral position that is the thing, it's the struggle that lifted up the mayoral position and that he's running on. That's the most important thing, because you can have a person become mayor and they can make all kind of promises, but he was not that type of person. But the Jackson Rising Conference, May 2nd through the 4th, is actually begin the important work of laying the foundation to continue forward, to not just to win and be able to build the cooperatives, but also to expand the People's Assembly model around Jackson in every neighborhood. And hopefully we'll get some people down there. There's a lot of people who are interested in it going forward. And, the amazing thing is that the death of Chokwe, even though it was thought, it hasn't taken the air out of the movement. Just as the death of Hugo Chavez has not taken the air out of the movement in Venezuela. And there's a lot of comparisons you can draw between what's happened in Jackson and Venezuela. If you're paying attention, there's a lot of comparisons that you can draw. It's not completely comparable, but there's a lot of comparisons you can draw. And that just goes to show that it is a struggle. Because if it were just a matter of one person, then it would have gone away. And I had to learn that lesson. But it's the struggle, and if we recognize the brilliant leadership of our brother, he was actually very, very nice person. So it's a great loss to people personally. It's a great loss to the movement. But the struggle lives on, and it'll continue to.